Greetings and welcome to the Fatherhood Research and Practice Network webinar. Today's topic is a conversation with researchers about measuring economic security outcomes in fatherhood programs. Next slide, I'm going to introduce the Fatherhood and Research Practice Network and tell you a little about it. I'm Jessica Pearson. I co-direct it with Jay Fagan, and my colleagues are Rebecca Kaufman and Nancy Sonis. And we are a mixed team from Temple University and the Center for Policy Research in Denver. The network also includes approximately 40 practitioners and researchers who comprise our steering committee and work groups, the Bauman Group, a Denver communications firm, and we also partner with many of the organizations that help to publicize this webinar and the FRPN activities. On the next slide, you'll see a little bit about FRPN. It's a 5-year cooperative agreement with OPRI, Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. It began 2.5 years ago. We have about 2.5 years to go. And we target fatherhood researchers and programs that really focus on low-income fathers, and a wide range of programs of interest, and researchers, both those federally funded through the Office of Family Assistance and otherwise supported and enmeshed in other kinds of service organizations and programs. On the next slide, you'll see a little bit about just our goals. We have 3 main goals. One is to promote rigorous evaluation, and basically we're charged with trying to build the evidence base about fatherhood and create really a culture of evidence in the fatherhood world. Second, we want to build evaluation capacity among practitioners and researchers. And third, we want to disseminate information to facilitate this type of rigorous research. On the next slide, I can tell you a little bit about how we are promoting rigorous evaluation. We actually fund researcher practitioner teams to conduct evaluations. Our first round, we funded 4 projects. We are currently in the process of reviewing proposals and expect to make award on June 17th. So all told, we probably will fund about 10 projects through this initiative. We've developed and validated new outcome measures for non-resident fathers, dealing with parenting and co-parenting and father engagement and father-child contact. And we have those measures and instructional videos on how to use them on our website. And our team, the Temple University's PR team, is also conducting research on co-parenting and maternal engagement in the fatherhood field, in the fatherhood practice. The next slide tells you a little bit about how we build evaluation capacity. We have papers that identify gaps in the research and research priorities. We offer a 1-day certificate program on evaluation research for fatherhood program staff. In fact, next week we'll be at the Ohio Commission offering such a program. We do quarterly webinars like the one you're on right now. We prepare research and evaluation briefs on a variety of topics, including addressing IPV and fatherhood programs, and of course the issues of today's webinar, measuring economic security. We do monthly technical assistance calls with our grantees or our subawards, and also we're working with OFA grantees to help them with monitoring their progress and solving problems and maximizing the quality of their research efforts. And we help practitioners and researchers find one another and partner up for research. The next slide tells you a little bit about how we disseminate information, and with the working with the Bauman Group, we maintain and add to a comprehensive website, and I encourage you to sign up to the website so that you can receive our electronic newsletter and be linked to all the resources we have assembled about fatherhood research and practice. We have, on the next slide, I've tried to sort of explain why we are having a webinar on measuring economic security outcomes in fatherhood programs. And judging by the big turnout for today's webinar, I think it's a good idea. I think the reason is that from its inception, fatherhood programs have been tied to goals related to employment, income, and financial stability. They typically serve fathers who face intense challenges in achieving economic security, and the security needs of fathers really drives practice and programming in the fatherhood field. So we know that for their children, poverty is an intense problem that's associated with negative child outcomes, and it's most acute in single-parent households. The topics, child support is an important part of the conversation in addition to employment and income earning activities, because next to mother's income, the second largest income source for poor families, and many programs try to help fathers understand their child support situation, improve payment, and address and lift enforcement actions against them. And figuring out how to measure economic outcomes and the economic status of fatherhood program participants when they first enroll is not so obvious, and it's hard to get some kind of practical information about how to do it. What's the best measure? What are the subtle differences and not so subtle difference between using one measure versus another? Is it done through surveys? Is it done through the use of administrative data? How do you get hold of that administrative data? So today we've assembled a team of a terrific team of researchers to help guide us in this. First, on the next slide, you'll see the briefs that we have prepared about these issues to accompany today's webinar, and they are posted on FRPN.org, one on measuring financial support, and next month we'll be putting up in 2 weeks one on measuring employment, income, and financial stability. And you're welcome to avail yourself of those written materials. But today's speakers, and they're shown on the slide, are comprised of Brett Barden, Elaine Sorensen, and David Pate. Brett's going to start us off. He's a research associate with MDRC, and his research focuses on employment and training and income support programs in serving hard-to-serve population. And he's been working on some of the main large-scale random assignment studies dealing with this population, the Enhanced Transitional Jobs Demonstration Project, and the Transitional Employment Demonstration. After Brett talks about income and employment outcomes, Elaine Sorensen will talk about financial support, child support. And Elaine is a senior advisor at the Office of Child Support Enforcement. Prior to this, she was a researcher at the Urban Institute, and she has done seminal work on child support and how the agency can work with low-income populations, low-income fathers, evaluations and assessments that look at child support debt, the pass-through, to really workforce initiatives, just so many of the initiatives in the child support field over the last 20, 25 years. Elaine has been there. And then we're going to close out with a presentation by David Pate, who is an associate professor of social worker at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and is also involved with Institute for Research on Poverty. He's an expert on fatherhood and low-income men and child support, and really the challenges to economic security for this population. And he's involved with large-scale study of the experiences of low-income fathers with the court system and the child support system. And I think that his research and his work will inform this presentation. At that point, we're going to open the floor up to questions, and you'll get more instructions about how to do that. So right now, I'm going to pass the virtual mic to Brett on measuring employment and earnings outcomes in fatherhood programs.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jessica, for the introduction and for the information about the various goals of the Fatherhood Research and Practice Network. As Jessica mentioned, I'm going to be presenting today about measuring employment and earnings outcome fatherhood programs. I work with MDRC, which is a not-for-profit research organization based in New York City, whose goal is to improve information and knowledge about social policy affecting low-income families. Many on the phone may have come into contact with us. We do a lot of randomized controlled trials and a lot of analysis of fatherhood and fatherhood programs and fatherhood populations. As an overview I'm going to cover today, we're going to talk about why we want to collect these information, which Jessica's touched on. We're going to talk about different types of information that programs can collect. We're going to focus a little bit on some of the advantages, disadvantages, limitations of these various sources of data, and touch a little bit on ways to go about collecting them either from agencies or in developing measures for service. And then lastly, we're going to touch on some common measures that are derived from the data and that you might see throughout various reports or various programs in measuring the outcomes of their participants. So Jessica's touched on this some, but why measure employment and earnings? Well, it's to find out how participants are doing in terms of employment and economic stability at various points related to program services and in their lives. Oftentimes, I think we get very focused on outcomes. We look to see what's happening after someone has been with a program, but we sometimes forget that the information can give us rich details about what was happening before a program, at program intake, and throughout the program. So it helps us to understand both past employment and earnings of participants, but also to observe changes in employment and earnings over time and see how participants are doing. So in terms of what types of data fatherhood programs collect, we're going to talk about this in detail, but the short answer is it depends on what kind of questions your program is trying to answer. the information available for employment and earnings be divided into two main categories. Administrative records is one category. The other category are self-reported outcomes. There are various types of self-reported outcomes and various types of administrative records. I've listed some examples here. This is not an exhaustive list. We'll talk particularly about state unemployment insurance, also known as UI wage records, as our main source of administrative data. Self-reported measures can include everything from surveys to information that you collect about participants when they first enter your program, or information that you collect through conversations or through case management ongoing while folks are with your program. And when I say surveys too, surveys can be a questionnaire, a form you hand someone. It can be a formal survey conducted by a survey firm. There's many different types of surveys that can obtain self-reported information. There are advantages and disadvantages to each type of data, and so we'll look at some of the questions that they can answer to help you make decisions about which type of data you might want to pursue. So we're going to start with administrative data. Typically, when researchers are looking at information from administrative data, we're talking about unemployment insurance wage records. These are collected by state unemployment insurance programs just as a routine part of administering unemployment insurance benefits. So employers are reporting on the earnings of participants as required by law, and that happens to just be a really great source of information for researchers because it contains the total quarterly earnings that a program participant made, so their entire earnings per job, so for every job they worked during a particular quarter. There's also a little bit of information that the records contain related to the employer themselves, and that sometimes some states you might get the employer name, some states you might get the industry and industry code. It varies a little bit by state in terms of what's available and what state agencies may give out. These data are good at answering a variety of research questions, particularly dealing with very specific information. So how much exactly did folks earn in a particular quarter? How many of your participants were working in a quarter or a specified follow-up period, like a year after they entered program services? And questions around how many employers folks worked for, and a little bit about industry. The main advantages of these data are that they are pretty comprehensive for the types of employment that are covered. They cover most formal employment, and I'll talk about some of the things that are covered by these records. But the other advantage is that you can obtain information for participants you may no longer be in contact with. Since these are being submitted by employers across the state, there is a very comprehensive set of data available. Regardless if you've been talking with a participant or not recently, you can see how the whole of your population that you've been serving has been doing in a specified follow-up period without worrying about, well, who can you not get in contact with to get information. They contain pretty detailed information, very specific information about earnings, and they are not subject to some of the problems that might come up with self-reported measures, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But by being very accurate, they're particularly useful for historic trends and changes over time. They can show you a complete picture for as far back as records are available. Sometimes that's many, many, many years. So you can see the history of folks coming into your program, see how things look after they've been in your program, you can do things like before and after analysis, and this is even context where you're not doing a full-on randomized controlled trial. You can still look at these types of changes over time. I think another thing that we sometimes forget is that this historical information can also give you a hint about what's going on with your populations at program intake, to see sort of how folks have been earning in the time leading up to receiving program services. So when someone's coming to a fatherhood program, it can be helpful to understand, well, are they coming to you at a particular period where maybe the majority haven't been employed for the last quarter or two? Is that why it might imply like why they might be seeking out services, or is it a much longer term issue? Do you see some earnings but low earnings? Do you see no employment? These can kind of inform what sorts of services you may want to offer. Some of the limitations, the primary limitation is that they can be difficult and time-consuming to obtain, but they are obtainable. You probably, in most cases, many programs have release forms that participants sign related to data and follow-up into your program. If you don't, then there are many resources there to help you design these, and all of us on the call, I'm sure, are happy to provide information about how to design such releases or consent forms. Without them, it can be difficult to access these data since they're private records held by state agencies. The process for obtaining these data are usually establishing what's either a data sharing agreement, usually a memorandum of understanding or a memorandum of agreement, which it will be between your organization and the State Department of Labor that manages these records. The process can be a bit lengthy, and there are occasions certain states do not give out these data, so it can be a non-starter in some states. I will say that the few states that were reluctant to give these data out in the past over the years have been better about that. But it is a process to hammer out these agreements. There are lots of different researchers out there who can help you, can provide advice. The process varies considerably by state in terms of how long it might take or what is required. But again, this is a very rich data source, so oftentimes you can establish a long-term agreement that will provide you ongoing information for some time. So it has a very high payout. Since the process varies bit by state, I'm not going to get too much into it beyond what I've just discussed, but I'm happy to take questions or later individual follow-up of particular states. Once you receive the records, they can be a bit resource intensive to process, clean, and analyze. They're generally cleaner data than than most administrative records, but it can be a complex task to sort through, and it's not something that you might want to just do like in Excel or something. You want to have more of a dedicated programmer or staff member or contractor or research organization you partner with to process the records, clean them, and prepare them for analysis. Another limitation is that they don't include informal earnings, so under the table earnings or earnings that are generated as an independent contractor. And this has actually been a growing point of contention. I'm sure many of you have heard of this, that the misclassification of employees is becoming a theme. And so individuals who before would have been a W-2 individual on the payroll of the employer are now often being classified as 1099. It varies by state whether or not 1099 employment is given out by the state. It's usually not contained in UI wage records. So if individuals are being classified as a contractor instead of a direct employee, then it can underestimate the employment earnings that you're seeing. So something to be aware of. The data often have a lag due to the reporting process. Employers typically have up to about a year to submit corrections to employment and earnings records that they've turned into the unemployment insurance programs. We typically wait about a quarter or two after the quarter we want to analyze. So right now, the last quarter we would probably comfortably analyze would be the last quarter of 2015 because we're almost 2 quarters out from that. And then lastly, these records don't provide information on total time, like hours worked during a quarter. You just get information on the quarters that were worked and the earnings. So here's a list of just some common measures: average earnings, number of quarters worked, percent of participants employed. These are just up there for future reference. So now, self-reported data is the other main category. So these data can be questions that you ask directly. They can be in a form, as I was saying before, or they can be from a full-on survey tracking process that you can have in before, at program intake or follow-up. They can cover a variety of topics, pretty much whatever you decide to ask. And they can answer the same kind of questions as administrative data, but they can also add information about job characteristics and employment that aren't in those wage records, which we'll talk about in just a second. But, of course, some limitations. The advantages of these data of self-reporting, either through survey or other means, is that you can obtain information on that 1099 employment and other informal employment. You can ask about specific job characteristics, such as whether it's permanent or temporary, if it's full-time or part-time. You can get it hourly wage, hours per week. You can be very specific. You can also find out job function instead of just the industry. You can look more specifically than just a quarter, so you know you can ask how many weeks people have worked, et cetera. And you can ask information about how people have found jobs, if they're looking for a job, why they quit their jobs, information around employment and earnings that might not necessarily be the exact question of earnings and employment, but are key to understanding patterns that occur. Some of the limitations is that there's imperfect recall, particularly for events that were long past. Participants forget things. You might have response bias, which means you only find a certain number. If we find 85%, well, what of people and get them to answer our questions at a follow-up point. What's going on with that last 15%? Are we getting the people who are most likely to be employed or most likely to be unemployed? They might not speak to your whole population. The question framing and priming can affect your results. The way to set up the questions might make it difficult for people to understand. They might say yes to something where really the answer would be no if you'd framed it some other way. And the mode matters there. We found that internet surveys get different answers than in-person surveys. Questions asked directly by staff. And lastly, survey efforts can be expensive and labor-intensive. So just some common measures here for your reference in the future. We've kind of talked through some of these, but the sorts of things, the bottom line is you get really more at job characteristics and how folks found employment. Lastly, self-reported information can, at baseline, is a specific thing that I just wanted to jot out a couple of notes on. So these are the types of questions that we ask typically when someone comes into a program so that we can get an understanding from self-report of like what their prior employment history looked like. So, in the past several years for various periods of time and for how long someone has stayed with a particular employer to get a sense of stability. To wrap up, a couple of examples of projects that are using these measures right now are the Enhanced Transitional Jobs Demonstration and the Building Bridges and Bonds Study. The Building Bridges and Bonds Study specifically actually involves a lot of fatherhood programs, so some of you may be involved or may have heard of it. These also involve some of the measures that Elaine and David will be talking about as well. And then just a few final thoughts and a little bit of advice before the question period in the next presentations. Are to always pre-testers that you're going to ask people and self-report. Do it with people who are already in your program. See if they understand the questions. Be careful about how you frame your research questions before you decide which data you want to pursue. You don't want to go after administrative data if you could have answered these same questions reliably with survey data and vice versa. It's always a good idea to check past projects to get examples of additional measures and outcomes of interest. And then ask around. Talk to folks with the Father Research and Practice Network. They'll connect you with researchers and other programs that have done this before and can talk you through how the process will work specifically in your state and how it might be most beneficial for your program. Since things vary by state, by program, by your needs, just always getting a sense of what's been done before and who knows what will really help you out. So with that, I will turn it over to Elaine to talk about child support outcomes.
Thank you, Brett. This is Elaine Sorensen from the Federal Office of Child Support Enforcement. I've been working there for about 3 years now. Prior to working there, I worked at the Urban Institute for many years, where I did research on low-income fathers and their involvement with the child support program. I have used both survey and administrative data to examine child support outcomes for low-income fathers, both at the Urban Institute and in my current job at the federal office. So I have a lot of experience examining child support outcomes using a variety of data for low-income fathers. What I wanted to talk about first is why you might collect child support information for participants in the fatherhood programs. Well, it's one of the primary goals of fatherhood programs is that their participants provide financial support for their children, and child support is one of the ways in which people can provide financial support. It's an obvious outcome to include in your analysis. Also, most fatherhood program participants are in the child support program, and they're legally required to pay child support. And as such, this can be a challenge for them, and many fatherhood programs will partner with child support programs to address this challenge of child support. And so that measuring the extent to which they're involved in the child support program can help you understand this potential challenge for your participants. So what kind of information did you collect with regard to child support? Well, there are two key outcomes that you always want to measure. First is how much is due, how much child support does the participant require to pay each month for their children who have a child support order. So the amount due or amount required to pay. And then the second measure you always want to measure is how much are they paying on a month for their children with a child support order. So there's the amount due and the amount paid. There are other relevant child support outcomes that you can also measure, such as child support arrears, the amount of child support due in the past, or you could also look at how many orders they have, how many children are covered by the orders. Those are also very relevant outcomes for child support. What kinds of questions can you answer if you have this information? Where you can measure the percent of fathers in your fatherhood program that have a child support order. You can answer what the amount is owed, what's the average amount owed, what's the average amount paid, what percent are not paying child support at enrollment, what's the average amount that they owe in back support at enrollment. And then you can, if you have information at enrollment as well as later on in your program, can see whether amounts of amount due and amount paid have increased or decreased over time. These are all of interest to your population. So here I just wanted to give you an example of what your data could look like if you did a pre-post analysis. And the pre-post analysis is the typical way to measure outcomes for a program. And it's designed here, the first column of information is the month prior to enrollment. So that's your pre, what happened to people at enrollment or right before they enrolled in your program. And then the second column of data tells you what's happening 6 months out after enrollment. So that's in this example, is the post component of the analysis. You have a pre-post analysis. And what we've done here is just look at the last month prior to enrollment, just 1 month of information, which can be very useful. Just that little information can be quite informative. At first, you can indicate how many of the participants are in the child support program and have an order. It's often 60 to 80% of fatherhood participants who have an order, so it's affecting quite a large number of participants. And those who have an order, you can look at the average amount they were owed in the month prior to enrollment. In this example, I indicated it as $500. Then you can measure the average amount paid, which typically is considerably less than the amount owed. Here I've written down $100. You can also measure the percent who paid nothing in the month prior to enrollment. And this example is 80%, which is often common. A very high percentage are not paying at enrollment. You can also look at percent of the order that's paid, and that's usually quite low. Here I've indicated at 20%. And then you can measure the average amount of arrears owed at enrollment, which can be quite high. In this example, I've estimated it at $5,000. So this just shows you the situation of participants who have a child support order at enrollment. And then you can compare those figures to information gathered 6 months or 1 later to see how those outcomes have changed over time. The goal typically of fatherhood programs for fathers in the child support program is to see that their orders are realistic, and typically that means to have those orders reduced during the first few months of enrollment in program. So a goal might be for the order amount, the average order due among participants to have been reduced during the first 6 months. And that's what I've shown here, that the average amount due is $400 at 6 months after enrollment. So you do see a decline. And then another goal would be to have the average amount paid, which is $100 at enrollment, to see that increase over time. And so the example here, I've pulled that to $200 a month, which might be unrealistic, but that's certainly a nice goal to have, to see that increase considerably. And then you could also, another goal would be to see that the percent who paid nothing, that would decrease over time. And then the percent of the order paid would increase over time. And then finally the goal would be to see the average amount of arrears owed would decline over time. And so this is just a very simple way to examine how child support is changing for your participants over time. Now, the key question that will come up when you examine child support is how many months of information should you collect with regard to child support? And in the example I gave, I just had you collect 1 month of information. I happen to think that is very useful. Just if you can collect 1 month, it really is informative about your program, about your participants in your program. Now, if you're lucky and can get more information, a longer period of data is more informative. It tells you greater information about the payment behavior. But it's quite difficult to collect more information. It gets complicated very quickly, and so you'll have to weigh that increased information compared to the difficulty that it will involve. So in the end, it's preferable to have more information, but it also increases the complexity of analysis greatly. So how do you collect this information? Well, you can ask your participants how much they owe and pay, and this is really helpful because, I mean, you are in contact with your participants. They're right there, and so you can just ask them this information. Now, one of the downsides just asking for what they recall as the amount they paid and the amount they do is that it's not consistent with what the child program has a record of. And the child program's record is the legal record, and so it's worthwhile, if you can, to obtain that information through the child support program. And it's relatively easy to do that for a small number of participants. Almost all child support programs have a web-based interface that allows parents to access their order amount and payment history online. So you can, when a participant enrolls a program, at the first time you have a contact with them or do an assessment, you can ask them to obtain that information and print it out for you through their web-based interface. And then you'd have that information record for anyone who has a child support case. Now, you can also try and work the child support program and obtain information on a large number of people through a batch process. The issue with having a relationship with the child support program and exchanging data is that there's sort of 3 challenges to this. And the first is just access is a challenge because of privacy concerns, and that would have to be overcome. Second, there are resources involved that the child support program would have to provide in order to provide you with information in a batch format, so that resources may be limited, and that could be a challenge. And then finally, it's the technical issues involved in the child support data are sizable. So you really have to sit down and work out exactly what you need and what you're receiving. So these can be overcome, and I just talk about how to overcome each of these challenges. The privacy concerns can be overcome. The child support programs all have a disclosure form that the Fatherhood program can use and ask their participants to sign this disclosure form. And then if they provide those signed forms to the child support program, the program can then in turn provide child support information about the participant to the Fatherhood program. So these disclosure forms are the key way of addressing the privacy issues that access can cause. And then finally, you can overcome. Some child support programs are able to devote IT resources to creating a computer program that can allow them to extract the data that's being requested. That just would have to depend on each of the offices what their resource constraints are. And then finally, the technical issues, you'd really need to sit down and have a documentation about the data being requested and provided to facilitate this process. Now, there are other measures besides child support, certainly, to measure financial support for children. The issues become quite complex quickly, however. With total financial support, you'll have to decide you have to make some key decisions. First and foremost is, are you going to be measuring financial support for all of the children that a father has, with those who are living with him as well as those who live elsewhere? And if you do want to measure financial support for both resident children and children living elsewhere, you'll have to decide, how do you measure the amount provided children who that father lives with. The financial support that fathers provide or parents provide their kids they live with is typically, those expenses are family expenses, therefore food and rent, utility. And so it's not at all clear how much of those expenses are devoted just to the child. Allocating expenses to just the child is not as always clear. And so what researchers often do is just measure expenses for the family and examine the extent to which those resources and expenses are available to the participants. Besides that question about whether you're going to examine financial support for resident kids and non-resident kids, the other issue that you need to decide is, are you going to be measuring expenses for children that are not necessarily the participant's own children? He could be living with children from his current partner or other children that he is supporting that are not his biological children. And if he's supporting other children, then that's other than besides his own, you may want, as a program, you may want to measure those financial contributions as well. So there's the family situation of your participants gets complicated very quickly, and measuring who he's supporting can be a challenge that you will have to figure out which children you really want to capture that he is providing support for. If you just focus in on non-resident children, the children that are not living with him, there's child support being provided, but there's also informal support that can be provided, especially among fathers who are not in the child support program. Research shows that a lot of informal support is being provided and is worth measuring. The question then, once you're starting to talk to your participants, you'll have to be careful how you define what is a non-resident child. And the research, the surveys typically just ask a simple question. Do you have children under the age of 18 who live elsewhere all or most of the time? And that sometimes works. Sometimes people get confused by that question. And so researchers will ask a slightly different set of questions. They'll start with, do you have children? How many children have you ever had? And then talk about each child separately. Get the names of those children and then ask, where does that child live now? And does that child live with you most of the time or part of the time? And that usually provides more accurate information if you're able to talk about each child separately that the participant has had. And then the other aspect that you'll need to decide about when you're deciding to measure financial support is, are you going to be measuring it for just the last 30 days or for a longer period of time? So here in this slide, I've listed a set of questions that you could use to capture payments over the last 30 days, but then you may want to do it for a longer period of time. And as Brett was mentioning earlier, there are issues. It's nice to have a longer period of time because it shows how the contributions over a longer period, how reliable are those contributions. But there is a recall issue. To what extent will the participants remember how much they've paid over that extended period of time? There may be an issue of them remembering how much they've paid. And then finally, you want to decide whether you want to examine financial support over all of the children or just one child at a time. The researchers have found that you ask about information about each individual child, you get more accurate information. And so that can build off a roster of information on children. If you've asked where are they living most of the time, then you can ask how much are you providing for support for that child, and that typically provides more accurate information. although it's not always that, because sometimes children are living together, and so the amount that they provide covers more than one child. And so all of these decisions have to be made and have compromises and limitations to them. Now, finally, you could measure non-cash support as well. This is, in addition to formal support and informal support, you can also be providing non-cash support. Questions that surveys have asked in the past to capture this information are listed here. For example, you can say, in the past 30 days, did you buy any items such as food, diapers, clothing, or school supplies for your minor children living elsewhere? And then you follow that up with, how much money did you spend on these items? Because you would like to quantify the amount spent on these items. So these are questions that have been asked in the past and could be included in your analysis of contributions of your participants. You can also ask these on a per-child basis if you like. That is thought to provide more accurate information. And then finally, there's more information on this, on measuring financial support for fathers and fatherhood programs. Jessica Pearson mentioned earlier a brief that's come out from the Fatherhood Recent Practice Network that's listed here on this slide. Also, there's a website called Fatherhood and Marriage Local Evaluation Cross-Site Projects that has information on conducting evaluations for fatherhood programs. And there's a list, inventory of measures for use in fatherhood programs that you may want to examine. The website is given there below. And there are two studies that are in the field now, in addition to the one that Brett mentioned on enhanced transitional jobs demonstration. There's the PACT demonstration, Parents and Children Together. This is examining 4 responsible fatherhood programs and 2 healthy marriage programs. And they're examining grantees' experiences operating their programs and the perspectives of the participants and the effectiveness of these services. There's a set of reports that have already come out. There's a survey that was done at baseline, and they have follow-up surveys. All of that information can be of use to you as you begin to think about examining participants' financial contributions to their children. And then there's the child support non-parent employment demonstration. That also has a baseline survey and a follow-up survey, which could be of use to you. It's studying 8 child support-led employment programs for parents behind in their child support and are employed or unemployed. And the website there is listed if you're interested in finding out more information about the demonstration. So I'll turn it over now to David.
Thank you, Elaine. I'm going to try my best to give you guys enough time to ask questions. So I have my monitor in front of me to make sure I follow the time clock, and also I'm going to be somewhat to the point about a number of things because my colleagues Brett and Elaine have given you a lot of good information on some of the challenges, the advantages, and to collecting information on economic security. I'm going to be coming, of course, from more a qualitative point of view, as that's the role I generally play as a researcher, and hopefully provide some information that will be helpful for those of you who are on the call. I know this is a rather complex audience and that we have those who are practitioners and researchers, so I'm going to try to attend to both of those. And that, giving you a little bit of my own background, is that I was a former practitioner myself who provided fatherhood work for 15 years and also I'm someone now who's a researcher and also has been someone who worked at the Center for Family Policy and Practice in my policy work. So I'm going to try to give you some of the advantage of what I've learned in the last 30 years of working with men who owe child support. So hopefully it'll get to answer all of your questions, if not a lot of your questions, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards. Next slide. When we say economic security, and I have that as my first comment, I want to be sure that we all are on the same page here. Generally, when I mean economic security, and also what the definition is something that I tend to use, is what is the access to basic needs, what's the infrastructure that allows them to be able to have access to health, education, housing, social protection such as social welfare programs, but also what are some of the work-related security issues that will be possibly arising that may limit their ability to take care of themselves in addition to their children, in addition to the partners they may be either living with or sharing a child with or raising a child with. So there's a variety of ways of looking at economic security. It could be income security, it could be labor market security, it could be employment security, it could be job security, work security. But when I look at economic security as a qualitative researcher, I'm looking at what is available to these men and their families and to the women as they try to raise a child in a very specific manner, and particularly in the structures that may be challenging their ability. Some of the things that Brett said earlier, why collect this information? And for me, it's important to do that for an individual participant. One, you want to have some historical information of how you to plan programs, but also as a researcher, it helps me to understand what am I learning, what's the phenomena that I'm going to get information on that will help me better understand what is the context under which these people are living and working their day-to-day. One of the things that in the more recent manuscript that Nancy and Jessica Pearson and Nancy Holmes has written, and it's available to you. There's some items here such as income from a job and SSDI and SSDI, et cetera, that are really very important. So as a practitioner, I definitely will want to have all these sources of income as to what is it available to these men in order for them to be able to take care of themselves and to make sure they attend to whatever other issues they need to be attending to be able to be the parents they need to be. So it's real important to look at not just the quantitative information that we get, but also put it in the context of some qualitative information, because one, that qualitative information is going to help me to better understand and also obtain some really detailed data that's going to be able to help me illuminate what is the circumstances under which these people are living or these families are living on a day-to-day basis in order for them to meet the goals or whatever the program is that I have set up, fatherhood practitioner, or what am I looking for to learn as a researcher. So again, the information that Nancy and Jessica have provided in the most recent manuscript could be very helpful to you in looking at in terms of information that would be good to obtain for your programs. Next slide. Thank you. One of the things that I have tended to do as a researcher is look at what are some of the key demographics of the city within the context of a race and gender lens particularly. I've listed 4 areas here that I think are really very important: employment rate, poverty rate, educational attainment, and incarceration rate, particularly to the men that we're talking about in many of these fatherhood programs that we are providing service in, or those of you who are providing service in. But for me as a researcher, it's important for me to know how does what is the current employment rate? So if I take Milwaukee as an example where I do a lot of work, Milwaukee has an unemployment rate that is very high for low-income black men. It tends to be somewhat a little bit lower for those who are white. So again, depending on which man is in your program, there's going to be some different outcomes that you're going to get around employment and access to employment. Milwaukee as a city, again, it's the poorest city in the country. So what does that mean to be the 4th poorest city in the country, and who is going to be affected by that number very differently? Educational attainment is really important because I know that for black males, graduation rates are not very high. And also we're seeing an intersection of employment and education. But also we're seeing an intersection of an incarceration rate. And I live in a state, or I do most of my work in the state, where incarceration for black men is extremely high. So therefore, when I'm looking at these areas of incarceration, employment, education, and poverty, what's the intersectionality of all of those on the ability of these men to be able to adhere to whatever is the requirement of the program, but also what is the intended outcomes of the program so that they'll be able to provide the best services and tailor those services to those men in a way that are going to make sense. Pretty much what's been talked about already by the previous 2 presenters. So again, we want to be sure that you understand the context of the city you're working in, because it's these men and these women who are in these programs, particularly the men who are in these programs, or the women who are in these programs as well, or may not be able to attend to some of the outcomes you're trying to get based on the structural barriers that they're going to be confronted with. So I really recommend highly to look at that, the demographics of your city in terms of particularly not just the demographics, but also just what are some of the structural issues that may, unfortunately, cause you to have more problems with your ability to meet your outcomes that you're looking to receive. Also, one thing I wanted to mention before I forget is that it's really important to think about also triangulation, which is a word that we tend to use in the qualitative field in terms of if you're getting some information that requested by Brett and by Elaine in terms of ask for the child support order, ask for information about what they're doing, and see if you can triangulate that with what's the city data that you find. If you're working with a researcher, what's some information they can give you around unemployment, the unemployment rate, education rate. Talk to your men that you interview and women that you interview around what is their own attainment of education. How often have they worked or not worked? Have they been incarcerated? Because when I get into the next slide, we'll talk about more specifics as it relates to these 4 areas as to what I can see are some of the bigger barriers and challenges. So when you secure individual histories, which I find to be the most telling part of the work that I do, and also the most helpful part in helping a program to be able to do all they can do for their clientele, their participants, there's a lot of data that's out there now and by many researchers that shows that those who are not graduating from high school unfortunately may have an interaction with the incarceration system that is much higher, particularly for black men. If you don't graduate from high school, your chances of being incarcerated are much higher. There's also this issue of a black-white gap. One of the researchers who I have tended to reference most often that has had some really valuable information on this has been Derek Neal and Armand Rick from the University of Chicago, 2 economists who have looked at over a historical period of time, what does it look like for black and white men who have been incarcerated, and what does it mean for their employment rates? And you tend to find in the prime working years that black men are the ones who have the highest rates of incarceration, but also they're finding that this issue of incarceration affects their ability to ever be employed. And that's some of the work that we're also seeing from people who like Michael McLeod at University of Wisconsin Madison and the sociology department, that this interaction between incarceration and between employment is a big deal. Also, one of the things that I have found when I do my work around some of this more individual information that I obtain, when I use qualitative data sets such as NVivo or MaxQDA, I'm able to make manipulate and use the software that enables me to see of my sample of men I'm looking at, where do some of these intersections occur, which is where the use of qualitative data sets get to be very helpful and very handy for you to be able to tell a story as to who you're working with, but also to help you figure out how to tailor your program in a way that's going to be most beneficial to the families that you're concerned with, but also for the researcher to be able to understand the population that they're working with as well. So again, employment history is something that's really important. If this person has had an inconsistent employment history, that of course sends a red flag, but also is information that's really important for you to be able to have in terms of how do you figure out what's best for this man, and how do you present them when you're being able to provide them with employment if you're a practitioner. For a researcher, this is a good way to know just who your sample is and what is some of the confines and constraints and strengths that they present in order for you to be able to meet some of the requirements that a program may have. One of the things that Elaine mentioned is that many of these men are required to pay child support because of the way programs are developed or currently designed. So therefore, if they are not employed, of course, they're not able to always the child support order that they have in place. And therefore, that could cause some problems where they may be, unfortunately, based on the state they're in and based on what are some of the sanctions that follow the non-payment of child support, there could be this issue that there is an interaction with being seen as in contempt or willfully not making your child support order. And you want to know, has your client had not necessarily that particular interaction, but have they had any interaction with jail citizens? Because jail and prison brings with itself a different type of outcome. There was a really interesting NPR story that came out this week on the whole issue of interaction with jail and low-income men, particularly men of color, where the fines and fees debts are very high. And therefore, if, again, this person is trying to meet other requirements of the program, how do other fees and fines interfere with that? Particularly if they had interaction with jail, there could have been fees and fines that they are still owe and are accumulating. And also that could also affect their creditworthiness, whether or not those programs interfere with their creditworthiness of where they may be able to in the future even rent an apartment to even where now they may be able to obtain employment. Creditworthiness is a really important issue for many people now in many places of employment. Of course, you want to know their child support order, their current debt or current order they have, but also arrears. and also in addition to their child support order, whether or not they have any other assignments that they have to deal with around the child support system. Do they have a birthing cost? Are you in a state where birthing costs associated with a Medicaid birth has been charged to this non-custodial parent? It's important to know that because, again, that affects not just them and their economic security, but it affects the mother of the child, but also the child, their ability to be able to be engaged with it if there is other debt. One of the things I have been finding that's a big issue around economic security for these men is housing and their living arrangements. You want to know where they live, how they live, are they able to, if they get a job, wash their face, brush their teeth. Are they able to make a job in a way that's going to present in a good place if you're a program, but also for the researcher to understand what are housing constraints that these men face, and some of that's been very well documented in the most recent book by Matthew Desmond, particularly as it focused on Milwaukee, but also some other researchers are seeing this issue of housing. And one person that's done it most recently has been Catherine Eden and her Timothy Nelson, and they're doing the best I can. That was one of the things that they brought up in their book stories about what are some of the issues that confront these men and their ability to be economically secure. Other important things are how are they eating? Are they using food banks? Do they have a history of using SNAP? Again, with SNAP, only allowed 3 months out of 3 years to use that benefit. But how are they eating? If they're not living with a child, how are they making the ends meet around just being able to eat? And I know in the study I recently did on WIC, I was very surprised to find that a large number of men are involved with are part of the WIC program. And I have to give a recognition to Kenosha for making sure that they now have a fatherhood program or a fatherhood portion within their WIC program that's funded separately because of this whole food insecurity is a big issue for men. Know whether or not they've used temporary agencies as a way to make ends meet. So again, you have another employment history, but if they're using temp agencies on a consistent basis, how secure is that in them being able to maintain some job security or income security? And whether they're banked or unbanked is another issue. And again, it depends on the population of men you're working with. For black men, that tends to be particularly low-income black men, being banked is a big issue. It's generally an issue that's an unreal issue, so they tend to use payday lending locations or others that are not your traditional way of being able to secure credit. But again, for me, all this is around economic rationality, looking at what's the rational way of looking at these men around the securing of a economic security, but also what are the barriers structurally that don't allow that. And also it allows you as a practitioner and a researcher to tell a story of why some things may not be possible. Again, hopefully within the question and answer period, I'll be able to get to more of that. But I do, out of respect to my 15 minutes, I have 5 seconds left. I want to stop here, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much to all three of you. This is Jessica again, and we're going to move to the next slide that lets you know how you can get into this webinar with questions. But while you're sort of queuing up for that, I want to start off by asking our presenters a question. You know, at Center for Policy Research, we've done many studies using both administrative and survey data looking at economic outcomes and status. And question is, you have a sense of the different kind of picture of participants that we get and their economic status depending upon measure or the type of data that we use? Do they all tell us pretty much the same story? Do you find if you use administrative data, is it going to look like people earn a lot less than when you get survey data? Is it going one tend to overstate or understate? And I guess I'll take it in the order that you spoke. Brett, what have you found about differences?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There certainly can be differences. I think our general approach is to try to leverage which source we think is stronger for particular outcomes. So, for instance, around the question of earnings, we're most likely to rely on administrative data of earnings because it tends to be more accurate due to these longitudinal concerns that we have looking back over a long period of history. But for the question of like current employment, are you currently working, the administrative data and the survey data might both tell accurate stories but slightly different stories because of what they include. We typically find that with employment levels, you'll generally find it's most common to see that there's more employment measured in surveys. The survey will show that more of your participants are working. In addition to that, like, if we're talking about ongoing contact with participants, the participants you're working with might have a different set of responses than the full set. But surveys tend to measure these informal employment measures. But what's interesting is that even though we might see slightly different levels, like a survey may show us that 85% are working and administrative data may show that it's 75%. In randomized controlled trials, when we have a comparison group, a control group who didn't receive program services, we typically find that the impacts are very similar. They're often magnitude, they're almost certainly similar in direction. There are a few cases where they haven't been that way, but you typically are getting a similar story.
Okay.
Yeah, except for this 1099 issue that I brought up recently, which I think is continuing to muddle the story for us a bit. And the independent contractor problem is definitely becoming something that drives a different story in some places.
What about child support, Elaine? What kind of different picture do you think we find using different data sources?
Well, I think in general what we have found is that you get a pretty similar story whether you use administrative data or self-support data. The difference really is more how comprehensive, how many people are you able to get that information for. So that if you use administrative data, you are getting information for a larger group of people. You are able to follow them over time more easily. Rather than surveyed or data that you get from your participants. When you talk to participants initially, some of them won't even know if they have a child support order. Their recall is not that great. And also many of them you'll lose contact with them over time, and so you won't be able to talk to them 6 months or a year out.
Right.
So your what's Brett called response bias will appear. So although in general, I would say that both employment and child support outcomes are really pretty similar regardless of what source you use. But the administrative data tends to be relied on because it's considered to be more accurate, because it does cover a broader range of people, both at enrollment and the 12-month follow-up, whatever length of follow-up you have. So while the stories seem to be very similar, there is a tendency to rely on administrative data if you can get it.
Okay. And David, I think maybe based on what you've talked about, maybe is there some key background characteristics of participants that those who are using surveys, those who are using administrative data that ought to use for subgroup analysis and that are really so salient? It sounds like certainly criminal history is going to affect whatever outcomes programs look at dealing with employment and earnings and probably child support payment. Are there other must consider characteristics that researchers and programs should be aware of?
I mean, I think what you mentioned are all the key items that I would consider because of the intersectionality of all three of those. If you have the one thing that we didn't mention was education level. Finding is that if you don't have don't have a high school diploma, your chances are harder at obtaining employment. But I used all of that data that you mentioned and are previous to and Elaine and Breton as well. But I find that I tend to, unfortunately, because of the fortunately for me, I have to be affiliated with IRP in Madison, so I'm able to get access to some of the data that was mentioned that was, of course, administrative, and I find that it strengthens and supports my qualitative findings because oftentimes I find in my relationships with the people I interview, they're telling me the truth. I triangulated to be sure that qualitative data matches with what the self-report data is and any other items that I can receive from them that's going to help me to understand their history. And I think historical data on this particular person that you're looking at or your clients or participants is what enables me as a researcher to tell a story, but also enables a practitioner to be able to tailor their services and to talk to child support or anyone else about how to work with their men and women.
Do we have some questions? Do we have people who phoned in with questions?
Okay, let's go and open up the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is now open for questions. If you do have a question, please press *1 on your telephone keypad at this time.
Okay.
And we do. And our first question comes from Gregory Williams.
Yes,
with
Florida, Milwaukee. Yes. When you have such systemic long-term issues as reflected in a lot of the work that's been done here in Milwaukee with African-American men, is there something that's in the works to address these, what I consider these embedded issues seem to be pervasive, through the work of anyone on the panel or otherwise, even, with respect to this, the fatherhood program, because it just seems like it's gotten worse. I've been here about 30 years, and it just doesn't seem to, these issues don't seem to go away. So I'm just kind of asking a real general question in that respect.
You mean in the policy arena? Is there
yes,
a more, gosh, I think that may be above our pay scale. But although I think the Child Support Agency in the CSPED demonstration is trying to link people up with jobs. Yeah, Elaine, do you want to talk about that just briefly?
Yeah, there is definitely a movement within the Child Support program to try and address some of the barriers that low-income fathers have with regard to their child support. So in Milwaukee in particular, I know that there's been an effort by that child support program to link with Fatherhood programs. That's a relatively new relationship and collaboration that's been happening the last 10 years or so, is to try and collaborate between child support and fatherhood programs to address the challenges that low-income have with the child support program. And Milwaukee, I think, is an area where that relationship has been established. And the demonstration that I listed on my slides, the Child Support Non-Custodial Parent Employment Demonstration, or CSPED, is actually using child support funds to pay for employment, or using those funds to pay for employment services that community-based organizations or employment providers can use in the area of employment services for low-income fathers in the child support program.
And Brad, what about transitional jobs? Seems like that's a relevant policy move.
Exactly. So in the Enhanced Transitional Jobs Demonstration, which is linked to in one of the slides that I presented, it had 7 sites, and 4 of the sites focused primarily on non-custodial parents, many of whom were fathers. And one of those sites, one of those 4, was in Milwaukee. And so the results of that will be coming out around August, it looks like the current timeline. So check out that report. And I can't talk the results yet since they're not public, but it focuses on the use of subsidized employment and transitional jobs to help others who either have a history of unstable employment or, but also a lot have previous criminal justice interactions, whether it's arrests, convictions, time spent in prison, all of which can affect their outcomes. I think one encouraging thing, sort of broader policy context, broader scale to go along with your question, is that we've seen some states and cities, most recently New York and New Jersey, implementing things like ban the box to help with some of the criminal justice issues that have come up, where in employment applications, you can't ask about people's prior arrests or convictions, which I think is really important since we know that there's certainly evident racial bias in particular in arrests and convictions, and also income bias, people who can manage to get these charges thrown out versus folks who don't have the resources necessary to fight against it and might just accept the charge. So I think in the extreme cases of people who have criminal justice histories that are kind of making it difficult to get employment, there's some hope there. We're also seeing some child support agencies that are experimenting some with off-order guidelines for certain situations. I've seen increased number of child support agencies that are considering that or that are doing more like arrears forgiveness from the state portion of the arrears at least, and trying to navigate and work with both the fathers and with the mothers to try to make something that's a little more workable in cases where things may have built up quite a bit.
Okay.
Before you go on, I'd like to respond to that question.
Sure.
The one thing I wanted to say to Greg, who I do know of work I've done in Milwaukee, and him and I've talked to him about this issue before, in that, some of the issues around, and I know this conversation is focused on child support, there's something about child support. I think a child support system is definitely needed for those children to be able to be receiving some of the funds that they receive, but it's important for those who are online to really look at the Turner v. Rogers case as to how child support is supposed to be handled for very low-income men who have an inability to pay, and how the court is supposed to interact with those men. But also, it would be important to look at the Department of Justice recent letter around the issues of collecting debt and the interaction with incarceration, whether or not that's also two very structural important things that need to be alerted, that they need to be aware of as a program, but also as researchers, that men who are low income, who have no money, are to be treated within their court system and within the child support system.
Absolutely, important points. Another question?
Yes, and our next question comes from Juanita Devine. Please state your question.
Yes, my question, first of all, thank you for the presentation. It was well constructed and informative. Will we be able to get the PowerPoints from some website?
Yeah, get on, register, sign up on FRPN.org. This whole webinar and the slides will all be posted. So it's a good resource for a lot of things, plus past webinars that we've had and all of the measures that we've done through the network.
Okay, so you have to sign up. Second question.
Yeah.
Will there be a rebroadcast, like a tape that we can access through this website?
Yes, all this is being tape recorded, so you can listen again and again.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Once again, that's star one if you do have a question or comment. And our next question comes from Donald Hewlin. Please state your question.
Well, thank you for pronouncing my name correctly. However, the lady who just asked the question stole my thunder.
Okay.
So my question has been answered. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, thank you.
Once again, star one if you have a question or comment.
Do we have any more in the queue, or should I pop one?
Please go ahead.
Okay. I want to know, ask our panelists about informal employment and cash employment, and ask David, how big a factor is this? What are we missing in when we really use sources that really focus on formal employment, formal income? And what's the story that's not being told in the fatherhood program world and in our assessments? David, I have a feeling you hear of this the most.
I do hear men report about the types of jobs that they take based on the fact they can't get formal employment. Again, as I spoke earlier, the formal employment tends to be a little bit harder for these men. If we're focusing on black men with low education skills and infrequent employment, they're generally unless they're doing construction work and they're able to get that, they tend to do a lot of informal work. And I do record that. I do document that. I do talk about that in various places, but also it makes it harder for them to keep those type of jobs because then they generally, the men I talk to generally have a child support order. and they have to be able to make payments, and therefore their lack of ability to make a payment through a job, depending on the location they're in the country, that gets to be an issue. So they do try to seek employment, but oftentimes now it's getting much harder with the whole idea of checking someone's credit rating. Looking at your it's gotten better for everybody. It's gotten bad for everybody, white and black. However, for black men, it's just way off the scale. The disparity is way high. So I do give information that the men feel comfortable telling me what it may be. It could be from something that unfortunately may be illegal to something that's very legal. However, it's just a matter of whether or not they're able to secure that. And there's not as many jobs available to these men, particularly if they've had any kind of incarceration record or correctional relationship that makes it much harder.
Okay. Any other reactions to this notion of past employment and the assessment of economic outcomes, or on again, pick up jobs, that's the other way to phrase it, or how do we grapple with that?
So I'll just say something from a measurements perspective. So we often end up doing more like in-depth qualitative interviews with a smaller subset of individuals to try to pick up on some of more detail on informal employment, and to also get a better understanding of overall income in general, because income can be something very difficult to ask about in surveys or one-on-one conversations. One-on-one like interviews. It's more of a conversational techniques tend to give you a better picture of folks' income, meeting with people multiple times. But one measurement is that people trying to measure informal employment can be very difficult. In fielding and pre-testing surveys, we often spend a lot of time crafting questions, trying them out. And when we think that we've got a measure or a question, get at this issue of informal employment, sometimes it completely does not get interpreted that way by the population. We have to go to the drawing board and rethink it and say, okay, well, these fathers are not hearing this question the way we intended. Like, how do we recraft that? So I just wanted to point out that it can be a very difficult thing to get at, and you may have to ask something like a few times to So
what kind of language is understandable? Do you have some advice about what works?
Well, so most recently, we've tended in the past to use the term we'll throw around the term like odd jobs.
Odd jobs. Okay.
But I think we've been moving away from that. I think we would often combine it in a way and say, like, is your job permanent employment, including a part-time job, and that's more like formal employment. And then we'd say something like, or is it seasonal work, temporary work, either like through an agency or through day labor or an odd job. That seems to work the best for getting at this, but with some populations that doesn't work, and we've had to kind of recraft it and just broadly ask about employment and then ask about like the employer, and from that figure it out, and ask about the regularity of it essentially.
Yeah.
Another thing, though, Jessica, I want to follow what Brett said, is that it depends on the relationship you have with the person that you're coming to interview. If you have a relationship with the person you're interviewing, I have never had a problem getting information that I consider to be trustworthy and valid. And as a matter of fact, I find it very hard sometimes to stop them and have them stop talking to me because of the fact we've had a relationship. And I generally don't talk to men one time and then I'm done. It's over time that I learn to understand what their job is. Also, one term that I heard recently, which I found very fascinating, some men are now saying government-sponsored jobs, which means...
What does that mean?
It means that taxes are taken out of check.
Okay.
People consider government-sponsored jobs, and it's not a government-sponsored job.
It's a private job, but it's just on the books, and taxes are deducted.
Exactly. So that's something I've been using more recently.
Well, that's a good clue. I mean, because surveys have to be working with language that's understandable. So you're the translator.
At least for this moment.
Yeah.
And again, I want to echo what David said before about triangulation. The importance of kind of getting these information and like how helpful it can be to get in different ways. Because, like I said, even though we'll do a full-on survey effort and we'll analyze all the administrative data, it really does take this extra interviewing with folks, talking with folks, to just add the extra layer to get at some of these issues that aren't going to come out from like a one-time conversation with someone. So again, it gets at like what questions you want to answer, in terms of which data source you choose, but it can be very beneficial and can be a nice feedback loop for opening up new avenues to ask folks.
Okay. Well, what I want to say, if you move to the next slide, is that we really urge you to sign up for the Fatherhood Research Practice Network. I want to thank the presenters that did a great job in covering a lot of territory and making it accessible. I want to encourage all the callers to respond to a feedback survey that we're going to send out to you so we can suggest we can design other webinars that will be of interest. We had over 400 people sign up for this. I don't know how many ultimately signed on, but so we want to make sure that we're hitting the issues that you're really interested in, and welcome you to peruse the website and join us in future webinars. We do these quarterly, so I don't know if we'll do it exactly in August or we'll wait till after Labor Day and get another one going. So thank you, Brett. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, David. And to be continued in future FRPN webinars.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this does conclude today's webinar. We thank you for your participation. You may disconnect your lines at this time. Have a great day.